Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our discussion today entitled Beyond Blackout Tuesday, Continuing DEAI, Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Work. My name is Jess Johnson. I'm the Assistant Curator at the Bade Museum of Biblical Archaeology and also a board member for Cultural Connections here in the area, and I'll be moderating for tonight. This event has been created by Cultural Connections board members. Cultural Connections is a community of Bay Area museum, arts, and cultural professionals who meet regularly to exchange ideas, share resources, and inspire creativity. We offer programs and network events such as this, and we're excited to continue this year's series of virtual programs between now and May 2021. As a general heads up, this program is being recorded. As a brief announcement, our next program is scheduled for March 31st and will be about decolonization and current decolonizing efforts, particularly in a virtual sphere, which we are all currently living in. So stay tuned for email updates about that program and continue to check our website and follow us on social media. As many of us continue to log into conversations like this from all over, I also wanted to mention that since Cultural Connections is based in the Bay Area, we acknowledge that those of us in the Bay Area are on the ancestral land of the Ohlone people, and if anyone would like to offer another land acknowledgement, please feel free to do so in the chat. I've seen some wonderful statements already as people are introducing themselves. Lastly, I want to give a huge thank you to my fellow Cultural Connections board members, Sal Alper and Natasha Reichel. We planned this program together with a lot of meetings and hard work and cooperation, which is absolutely appreciated. And our fellow Cultural Connections board member, Maureen, who is helping us out with web and tech tonight. With that being said, we're going to start off and hit the ground running by introducing each panelist before they share their insight and expertise with us through their lightning rounds. Then each panelist has been asked to prepare a pointed question, and they're going to pose that question to other panelists, of which our panelists are free to answer. So hopefully that will create some illuminating discussion. After that conversation, we will be facilitating breakout rooms with our participants, panelists, and Cultural Connections board members, where we will discuss some key issues surrounding DEAI, work things out together, and try and find some common ground. After that, we will briefly reconvene after that departure and finish with any questions that the audience might have, summaries about the things we talked about in our breakout rooms, and some hopeful and insightful statements to be able to go forward and continue our own individual DEAI work. So I know that I'm looking forward to some productive and engaging conversation. Through our program, our audience can feel free to participate in the chat with commentary and questions. We'll be monitoring to make sure that we can answer those when the time comes near the end of the program. So first off, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Christine Lashaw. Christine's worked at the Oakland Museum of California, OMCA, for 21 years, developing exhibits with community members. As a member of OMCA's collaborative exhibit development team, she leads conversations and designs activities with diverse local communities. She is committed to engaging museum visitors with exhibits built around voices and stories that reflect their own experiences. In 2017, she co-authored a chapter in the Mass Action, Museums as Sites for Social Action toolkit about sharing authority when creating content and experiences. She has BFA from Rhode Island School of Design, and Christine will talk about mass action accountability campaigns, which aims to hold our institutions accountable to the public statements made committing to racial justice. So please welcome Christine as she shares her lightning round with us.
So I was just going to begin by just mentioning that last year, probably around this time, actually, Evelyn Orantes and I actually held a couple of Cultural Connection sessions that were focused more generally on what is mass action. And I think as Jess just described, mass action stands for Museum as Site for Social Action. So if you're interested to learn more generally about mass action, then please go to this website and you can read all about mass action generally. This talk is going to be focused specifically on mass action's accountability campaign. So as everyone knows, on June 2nd, 2020, Blackout Tuesday, a large number of museums, mostly institutions which had previously been silent on social justice issues, published statements expressing solidarity with Black Lives Matter. Following that, on June 9th, in a conversation by AAM, Lonnie Bunch said that if museums want to respond to this moment, they should be turning their lens inward and getting their own houses in order. So in response, during the summer of 2020, Mass Action launched a campaign to explore how we might narrow the gap between institutional positioning and institutional accountability. And a group of us in the Mass Action Collective began aggregating data from the 1,088 accredited museums in the US. And our motivation was to consider each statement, or lack thereof, an opportunity for further dialogue and exchange around racial justice. So if museums are publicly articulating their commitment to racial equity, then they are inviting public accountability on these words. And as a collective, Mass Action is committed to advancing racial justice in our field. And the goal is to support museums moving from words to transparent and accountable actions. And you can read more about this initial launch of the campaign in the August 2020 blog post on the Mass Action website. So we first began with a spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet is actually now open and accessible to the public. And we first asked whether an organization made a statement or not. And if the answer was yes, then we analyzed it according to a framework of 6 criteria: acknowledgement, structural analysis, actions, outcomes, deadlines, and financial investment. And of these 1,088 museums, 572 made a racial equity related statement and 512 did not. Again, you can go to the October 2020 Mass Action blog post. And in that blog post, there's actually a link to the spreadsheet and a description of the 6 criteria with anonymous examples for each criteria. But I'm going to go ahead and give you a really quick overview of the criteria, because really these are meant to be a template for organizations that want to reflect on their ongoing institutional commitment to address systemic racism. So the first is acknowledgement. Does the statement acknowledge the organization's complicity in and perpetuation of racism as an institution, including examination of museum history and impact on staff and community? Number 2 is structural analysis. Does the statement provide specific institutional examples of racist and non-inclusive practice by the museum? 3 is actions. Does the statement give examples of actions the institution will take to address the above described racist or non-inclusive practices? 4 is desired outcomes. Does the statement articulate desired outcomes of anti-racist or inclusive actions? These are really key to gauging progress. 5 is deadlines. Does the statement provide estimates of how and when an anti-racist or inclusive actions will occur? And then 6 is financial investment. Does the statement commit any funding to the achievement of the above? So where is this work now? So there's a subgroup that is currently working on coding data from the statement analysis and all of the analyses and beginning to look for trends in the data. So the findings will be published on another Mass Action blog post, but they also hope to publish elsewhere. And since the public statements are just one facet of a really complex story, Mass Action has also posted a survey on that October blog post. And the survey is really meant for museum representatives and individual staff members to add nuance and context to the story told by their public statements. So you can find a link to the survey on the October blog post, and I really encourage any of you that are interested to go ahead and fill it out. And once I'm done with my presentation, in the chat, I will put links to the survey, and I'll also put links directly to those 2 blog posts that I mentioned. So in closing, I just want to say that I really hope that these criteria helps you to consider the ongoing DEAI work in your own institutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine, for sharing. I specifically appreciated that you talked about the methodology and the criteria. I think sometimes when we speak on a larger level about DEAI, we sometimes forget how to execute these types of things that are really going to push the work forward. So I appreciate that. Our next panelist is Triana Patel. Triana is an arts and museum educator with a decade of experience focusing on informal arts education for youth and families in cultural institutions. She is a passionate advocate for youth development and opportunity within the arts, museums, and alternative learning environments. Triana received her BA in art history from the University of California, Los Angeles, and her MA in museum studies and MBA with a focus on education and interpretation from John F. Kennedy University in Berkeley. She wrote her master's thesis on engaging teens in social justice through art and programming in museums. She is currently the manager for youth and family public programs at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, where she also serves as a leader for the museum's DEAI task force. Triana will be discussing how racial equality and DEAI work can be at the core of museum team programming. Triana, whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, as Jess was saying, I work at the Asian Art Museum, and today I'm really focusing on ArtSpeak, which is the museum's paid teen internship that has been around for 13 years at the museum, and the work that we're doing with the interns that really focuses and has a foundation of DEAI and equity work. Before I really talk about that, the museum, the Asian Art Museum, has also, like a lot of other museums, been really focusing and grappling with how to ensure that it is doing DEI work, both internally with like staff training, organizational culture, like that internal work, and also the external work around like public programs, exhibitions, the things that we put on social media, the things that we share through the physical space of the museum also. And in that, we have a really big DEI task force group with over 40 members. And a smaller DEI leadership team that has 5 members that's really pushing the museum forward and doing this work. We are a culturally specific, ethnic specific museum. We focus on all of Asia, but that, has a lot of people and voices, especially who live here in the Bay Area, that we consider the community that we serve. And I think, like most museums, was originally established with more of a an intended audience, like an intended white audience. And so the museum has really been trying to understand what DEI means to a culturally specific institution and how we can do right by the communities that we serve and the work that we do moving forward. But in this, like, the museum's been around for over 50 years and ArtSpeak has been around for 13 years. And that big program was initially created because we weren't attracting enough youth coming into the museum. We wanted to find a way to bring youth voice to the programs that we were creating and facilitating that had that DEAI foundation. 13 years ago, I don't think we were calling it DEAI. I think we were focused on, the interns wanting to learn about social justice and equity through conversations with artists, activists, curators, and then taking that learning that they were doing and putting it into in-person engagement with programs that we had with youth and family audiences. ArtSpeak focuses on youth and family audiences. This is the group of interns that we have this year. They're a diverse group of interns that come from all over the Bay Area. It's the first year that we've had a fully virtual internship for the whole program year. Last year, we were kind of thrown into it at the end in March when the pandemic began. And so we have interns who come from the North Bay, the South Bay, East East Bay, like Oakland and Berkeley, and then a few that come from San Francisco. They are so smart and dedicated to DEAI, and it's such a passion for each of them. It's part of the interview process when we ask interns to join the internship, if this is something that they work on. Some of the interns have and run Instagram accounts that call out racism in their schools and in their communities, and it's kind of something that we wanted to make sure that the museum was a space for them to continue their learning on social justice and DEAI and equity work. And in that, we've really learned how to pivot for working in a pandemic and being virtual. Originally, they were creating programs for in-person engagement where we would maybe create art activities that talked a little bit around DEAI for youth and families to create during a Sunday Family Fun Day or a cultural celebration. But now that we are fully in virtual Zoom mode, we've started to test out different ways that we can share what the interns are learning and the knowledge that they're really putting together in ways on social media. So the interns have been working on posts like these. These are 2 Instagram posts that we created that have multiple slides. I just couldn't include it all in the slideshow today for you to see. But talk about things like implicit bias and environmental racism, whiteness and white supremacy, race being a social construct, Black History Month and what that means today when we're fully trying to get people to support Black Lives Matter, and the big calls that came to museums, the big social action calls that came to museums last year in not supporting Black lives in the programs that they're doing or the people they're hiring and things like that. And so the interns are really taking these discussions and learnings and conversations they're having and putting it in these really beautifully designed posts for people to share and learn about. They're also creating art activities that focus on, these were both ones that focus on protest. We created them last summer. One of them was an embroidery activity that you could embroider something that you wanted to wear to a protest. And this was one an intern Dina created that has the Black Power fist and a rainbow. And that was something that she really thought spoke to her identity and wanted to teach families how to do. And then a collage activity that uses a Desmond Tutu quote around oppression and injustice, and like showing people how to kind of create these activities at home so families and youth can think about it outside of those formal structures of school and structured learning that they may have. They're also creating interactive zine templates. This is one that we are getting ready to share this weekend that was just finalized, and its title is How to Commit to Anti-Racism and Become a Better Ally to the Black Community. It's one that we created for Black History Month, but really the interns are thinking about how to really share these reflective and learning experiences that they're having through the internship and the curriculum that we are using with the broader community. And I think that has been a model for the museum to use in sharing things that they create with our members and with our general museum audience so that it gets a wider spread. I think the internship is one of those really small parts of the museum that has a really big impact. Youth voice is so necessary to DEAI work and equity work. And I think a lot of museums don't really give space for that. And the internship allows for youth to be compensated for the work and their time spent at the museum, but to really help educate the museum on how to teach people to kind of learn about DEAI work. So I'm going to stop sharing. I think I'm done.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Triana, for sharing. I really enjoyed hearing that the youth that you're involved with really have a passion for this, which is important. And you're right. So often when we talk about these, we forget that youth and family dynamic. But I really think the best way to be able to uproot some of those entrenched ideas that we have around this work is to target those who are going to take the baton after us, which seems so obvious, but is often so very overlooked. So we appreciate your efforts. Next, please join me in welcoming Caroline Fernald. Dr. Fernald is currently the Executive Director of the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. She has previously worked as Director of the Millicent Rogers Museum in Taos, New Mexico, and in multiple museums focusing on Native American art and culture. She holds a PhD in Native American art history from the University of Oklahoma and specializes in the history of collecting in anthropological museums. Caroline will be discussing how institutional trauma can impact DEAI work.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. And in all honesty, when I received the invitation from JESS, I was a little surprised. I assume that with anthropology museums, people don't typically associate an anthropology museum with being exemplary at DEAI work. And I certainly don't think that people associate the Hearst Museum of Anthropology as being the leaders in the field of that work. And so I thought, well, what can I talk about that would be kind of from that standpoint? What is it about the Hearst Museum of Anthropology that has affected this institutional trauma? And what can the museum be doing to kind of work with people beyond that? And also thinking like, why, getting to the point with, I've been at the museum just a little over a year, about a year and a half, and I'm learning more and more about the museum's history every day. And I think about every day I get horrified even more and thinking, why would anybody want to work with us? So many people hate the Hearst Museum. Why would anyone want to work with the Hearst Museum? And I'm finding and learning that people can still hate the museum and want to work with us. And so that's kind of an interesting idea there to work from. So to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from is I chose to go towards the career path of museum leadership because as a graduate student, I've had like a love-hate relationship with museums. And I was not satisfied as a graduate student just being somebody who could complain about museums. And I didn't want to be somebody who taught other people how to complain about museums or just write about what I didn't like about museums. I wanted to do something about it. And so I pursued museum leadership. And I regret it every day, but it's an interesting and it's an exciting work to do. So to talk to you a little bit about what is this institutional trauma about the Hearst Museum, to give you a very, very short, because I have like a 5-minute, 10-minute overview here, is a very short overview of the Hearst Museum. So we were founded in 1901 by Phoebe Hearst. So she's a philanthropist. She was a big advocate for education, specifically for women and children. And she was one of the first female regents for the University of California. And through her massive wealth that she inherited from her husband, she was able to travel a lot. And while she was traveling in Europe, she encountered a lot of anthropology museums. And she drew inspiration from her experiences seeing these anthropology museums and collections and wanted something similar to be brought to the University of California for the benefit of the students in their education. And she was not an anthropologist herself, but she was the patron. She financed a lot of anthropological and archaeological work. And this resulted in several of the founding collections of the Hearst Museum, and also some of our most well-known founding collections. So Jess, we talked briefly before this started, and Jess is familiar, I'm sure, with our ancient Egyptian collection, being an Egyptologist. We also have a large Andean collection and a native Californian collection. So the museums, the collections that she encountered in her travels in Europe, these are going to be museums where the spoils of colonialism, the trophies of imperialism are put on display for an almost exclusively white audience to enjoy. And so in American museums, as they were developing their anthropological museum collections in the United States in the late 1800s, and for the Hearst Museum, early 1900s, it's a very similar model. Modeled after that, but only with American settler colonialism prominently on display and American imperialism on display. So in the Hearst Museum's collection, we kind of have that broken down. So we have a very large, very vast collection, 3.8 million. And there's included in that collection, you have examples of American imperialism. We have a large collection from the Philippines, for example. We also have this large collection of Native Californian collection that includes thousands of Native American ancestral remains. And so one of the things that kind of happened recently is the Hearst Museum, talking about hatred of the Hearst Museum. The Hearst Museum was in the news, or indirectly by way of UC Berkeley in the news recently, because of the unnaming of a building. So the Hearst Museum gallery and a large amount of our collection resided in what was formerly called Kroeber Hall. And Kroeber Hall is named after Alfred Kroeber. He was one of the earliest directors, not the first, but one of the early directors of the museum and one of the early curators. And he's really well known for being a pioneer in anthropology, in that he worked a lot with Native Californians and collecting languages, recordings of songs, material culture. He also collected human remains. And he and this is kind of known as a practice now referred to as salvage ethnography. So just salvaging everything that you can from cultures and traditions that you think are going extinct. And kind of another term I want to introduce is coined by Renato Rosaldo, a scholar, and it's called imperialist nostalgia. And a lot of what figures like Alfred Kroeber were participating in was imperialist nostalgia. And what that is lamenting the loss of something that you're complicit in expediting that loss. So he's collecting material from cultures that are and benefiting from by bringing them to the Hearst Museum, that are expediting the loss of that information and that knowledge from those communities. And so with this unnaming of Alfred Kroeber, with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the taking down of statues that were memorializing the Confederacy, figures like Columbus, it got me really thinking about what is it that we celebrate at museums? What is it that we are kind of touting on our websites? Who are the figures that we memorialize? And this thing that I was kind of unsettled by is that we oftentimes celebrate this number. 3.8 million is in our collection. And that includes Native American human remains. That includes trophies of colonialism. And so really kind of questioning what it is that we are celebrating. And so kind of thinking of these ideas of what we have in our collection, what we celebrate, our institutional history, and how this can really impact our diversity, equity, access, and inclusion work. And just finding through this process that there are people that do want to work with us, but they still have the right and they still do hate us, and that's fine. I can work with that. So I'm not actually here to talk about the wonderful work that we're doing. When we are doing wonderful work, because I do see that I have some of the really fantastic staff members at the Hearst Museum here, Katie Fleming and Leslie Freund, and they are really leading a lot of fantastic work at the Hearst Museum and deserve that respect for that work that they do. But I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that I acknowledge that anthropology museums often are not the ones that you think of as leading the charge in DEAI work. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Yeah, I've gotten the opportunity personally to work at the Hearst, and you are right. All of the staff members that I've encountered are phenomenal, and they do have this mindset about what really needs to be done and how to engage in community. But maybe some of the struggles that you face is you can't just engage with the current times and work forward with DEI work. You almost have to also work backwards at the same time and figure out where you came from and how you can deconstruct that to have a better and brighter future. So I appreciate your insight. Okay, and our last panelist to share today, last but not least, is Dr. Desiree Whitmore, a Black Mexican-American and Southern California native. Dr. Desiree Whitmore, AKA Laser Chick, very cool name, by the way, began her education in community college and holds degrees in physical sciences, chemical engineering, and chemical and material physics. Her PhD and postdoctoral research focus was in the development of very fast laser systems to study single molecules vibrating, electrons traveling across the surface of metals, and the fluorescence of semiconducting quantum dots. Words I never thought I would say all in one spot. So after her postdoc, Desiree has held positions as a science curriculum specialist with Amplify Science, a professor of laser and photonics technology at Irvine Valley College, and is now the senior physics educator in the Teacher Institute at the Exploratorium in San Francisco. Her current work is focused on providing support and professional development to middle and high school science teachers to help them teach through inquiry. She is also a founding board member and mentorship advisor of the Council for the Advancement of Black Engineers, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to increase the number of culturally responsible Black engineers with PhDs, postdoctoral training, and professional engineering registrations. Dr. Whitmore, Desiree, will be sharing about her work as part of the Teacher Institute and the Staff Union DEAI Committee.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jess, for that introduction. And first of all, thank you for having me here. Similar to Caroline, you know, what am I doing here? I'm a physicist. And so it was very interesting when I was invited, even though I understand because I am a part of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, a part of the union at the Exploratorium. Now, I've only been here for 2.5 years at the Exploratorium. And it's interesting because I am the physicist here, and yet I do so much diversity, equity, and inclusion work, right? And I know that part of that is because I am a Black Mexican American woman, but also part of it is because I'm just really passionate about it and always have been. And so I'm always finding ways to be active in that realm. And so the museum actually has many different channels of DEI work that we do throughout the museum, but I'm not a part of all of it. And one of those that's very important actually is the Culture and Equity Committee, which I'm also a part of. I do attend many of their meetings, and they're a committee that Sal, who is here on this call, can talk about later during our discussion. And I'm also a part of the DEI committee, which is part of the union. Now, through that, a lot of our work, I was just elected 1.5 years ago. And as soon as it happened, the pandemic kicked in. And so there's been a lot of focus on DEI stuff. And so a lot of that has been reactionary, though. And so I'm not going to talk too much about that. I'm going to talk more about the work that I do with the Teacher Institute and the work that I do with teachers. So as Jess mentioned, we work with middle school and high school science teachers, not only in the Bay Area, but around the world. And a lot of what we do has contained DEI threads throughout it for several years. And one of the reasons is because we made it a priority from the beginning, right? So our director makes sure that we are always focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion in every single thing that we do. So we run workshops, we run Saturday workshops, we run an entire teacher institute over the summer and several alumni institutes. We work with explainers throughout the museum who are our interns. And throughout all of that work, we make sure that we're addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have weekly meetings in the Teacher Institute, and in those meetings, there is always time on the agenda to talk about equity, how we're addressing it, how it went in our last workshop. We start every meeting with norms, even just our group meetings, where it's just our team of teachers, and we know them very well, but we live them, right? And we have to make sure that we live them. And so that's how we have kind of gone beyond the Blackout Tuesday, as this panel is called. We also do a lot of work around supporting teachers, right? So we do science workshops. I'm a science teacher, right? And one of the things that is DEI focused in science teaching is the next generation science standards, which are the standards that are now used in most of the states in California. These are the national science standards, and they actually have an equity focus built into them. And the interesting thing is that the Teacher Institute, which has been around since the 80s, has always had that focus. And so it's really nice to know that the standards have caught up to the Teacher Institute, right? We think about inquiry, we think about asking questions so that the students can approach science as potential scientists, right? Because that's a huge problem. If you look at the field of science, all of the fields of science, what does diversity look like there? It's not very diverse. I can tell you as someone who's gone through academia. And so our goal is to really work on that by influencing children at very young ages through their teachers, right? Having their teachers get them very strongly engaged in science. And so aside from that work, one of the things that we do that we think is very important because we're working with teachers is we focus on teachers of color. And so we do have programming that is specific for teachers of color. And this started before I started at the museum. During our summer institutes, we bring teachers in for the whole, like 3 weeks during the summer. and we have many different institutes happening at once. And yet in each of those institutes, there's really only a couple or a few teachers of color within each of them. And so they are still very isolated. So we have these basically lunchtime hours once a week during the Institute where we bring all the teachers of color together to have one big space where we just hold space for each other and meet each other and have community and build community. And we work through problems of practice, and we work through tools to help these teachers deal with microaggressions, to deal with problems of practice that could be race related that they don't feel comfortable talking about with teachers at their own site. And so these went really well. And once the pandemic hit and we had to close our doors, we decided to move it virtually. And so we have them now about twice a semester. So 4 times a year, we bring teachers of color in, and it's actually great because it's not just the teachers on the campus, like at the museum, it's teachers all over the world show up. We have teachers from Costa Rica who come. We have teachers in like Washington, DC. We have teachers in Florida, New Orleans. And so we're all there together. And as a Black woman, I don't see a lot of Black folks in the museum. I don't see a lot of Black folks in science. And to be able, or even in the teaching field, and to come to these meetings and just see this like sea of not only Black teachers, but like the whole spectrum. It's just like so beautiful. And we are called people of color because we are colorful people. And so it's so nice to be able to spend time with them. And we've gotten this feedback. So we decided like we need to measure our progress, right? Hold ourselves accountable. Are we just doing this to be performative? Are we actually helping the teachers? It needs to be about them. And so we actually do surveys, anonymous surveys for all of the teachers. We do polls in the beginning to ask how they're doing, and polls at the end to ask how they're doing. And every time consistently, the way that they're feeling shoots up by the end of our meetings. Just this 1.5 hours that we have, once every other month, is just like it changes our whole mood. So it's not just me, right? It's like the teachers too. And their feedback has been extremely good too. All of the feedback is like, we need more of this. Can we have more than just 2 a semester, right? Unfortunately, there are only 2 staff in my department that are teachers of color. And so it's actually very difficult to have us run all of them, right? And so that's some of the work we do. And something else that we do that's very important work is we have an equity reading group that is not just in the Teacher Institute, but for all of the educators in the museum. And so we have a monthly reading group where we read an article that is chosen by one of the group members. And we come together and we just discuss it. What does it mean? How can we implement what we are reading into our work as educators in the museum? And then we also have an equity working group where we come together once a month and we report to each other. Like, what have you been working on? And what can we work on? How can we come together and join forces and be better and kind of set an example for the rest of the museum? So that's the work that I'm working on. And that's all that I want to share. Oh, I'll share one more thing, which is we created a page for our teachers because it was important to me as a Black teacher that Black teachers know that we're there for them and we care about them. And so we created a page that is called Black Teachers and Students Matter. It was created by myself and some of my colleagues in the Teacher Institute. And then we shared it with the whole educator group and got feedback from them, as well as some of our teachers that we work with. So that's all I have to share.
Thank you so much for sharing, Desiree. I think you really hit on some really key points. First off is performativity, right? And being conscious of that. And secondly, representation. I think sometimes when we work from these organizational standpoints, we're always thinking about the abstract DEAI, but the reality is we're also individually struggling with what that means for us, right? Some of us maybe more than others when we look around and don't see others who represent the daily struggles that we're facing. So I really appreciate that you brought that to light and that you're actively working to make that a better and sounds like more joyful experience for a lot of people. Again, thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their current work around DEAI and for providing us with some very illuminating food for thought. We are going to now circle back around to each of our panelists in the same order, and we're going to have them pose a question that they crafted to their fellow panelists. We included this portion in the program in hopes that the expertise and the familiarity of our panelists would yield some poignant questions and some really thoughtful answers that our participants can use to broaden their thought and maybe get themselves thinking about what they can take away from this program and to question really the current state of DEAI work. So I'm going to circle back around to Christine. I'll have you start. If you want to, please pose your question to the other panelists, and it's free form, so whomever of the other three feels like they would like to respond, just feel free to unmute yourself and share with us.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, these I have. There's so many things I could say, and I could have very pointed questions for each of you. I appreciated what you all had to offer. So I kind of am dialing back up with a bigger fisheye lens with this question and asking a kind of broader question for you guys. So here's the question. What in your organizations, what in each of your organizations' culture supports or inhibits moving this DEAI anti-racism work forward?
Oof, that's a loaded question, Christine. Triana, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I'll start. And please, Desiree or Caroline, if you want to add, please add. I think it's two things. I think our institution is finally really listening to our DEAI task force and like bringing us to the table with our executive team members to kind of find those support systems for doing this work. I think there are still, and you know, Natasha, who works at the museum, hopefully I don't get in trouble for this, but like there is still this sense that not everyone is ready to do the work personally or on an individual level. So how do you really move forward as a whole institution and organization to do that work internally and externally for your visitors and audience that you engage? And I think that has been the biggest thing for us in doing this work in a really strategic way. It shows all the time that staff need training, staff want training, staff feel like they don't have the resources or the time to learn about DEAI. So how do they incorporate it into their work that they do at their museum? And that has really been what I've noticed in doing this work, at least for the last 18 months.
Thank you. Yeah, and to your point, Jess, I know that was a loaded question, but that's really, that's the work that's required, right? Like that's how we're going to move any of this forward. So thank you, Triana, for answering in that way.
I can add to that too. Is like what makes this work possible? You know, a lot of the staff at the Hearst Museum have been doing some work like this. The university also, there's a luxury a little bit in being affiliated with the universities that we have that support structure there. And the University of California is very much prioritizing diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging initiatives. So we have resources, we have consultants, we have trainings. So we have that available to us to help us in that work. And the museum is also participating. Katie and Leslie are a part of this in the Of, By, For All program, which I cannot endorse enough. It's really fantastic. It has just very pragmatic guidelines for how to work with communities. And what's inhibiting that work, kind of what I talked about, our reputation. Our reputation inhibits that work.
Mm. Yeah, I think, Caroline, you pointed something out that's really important, is prioritizing this work above all else. And I think, Triana, maybe that's something that those who are not really ready to engage are struggling with, right? They are prioritizing other things, are prioritizing maybe their own experiences, and they're not realizing the broader scope of how this, well, in my personal opinion, and I hope everyone else shares this, how this work really will broaden and benefit everyone in the long run, right? Broaden and benefit the knowledge that we're able to disseminate and the interactions that we're able to have with our community. And riffing off of that, Triana, if you are ready, you can pose your question to the panel as well.
Yeah, I wanted to take it a slightly different way, something that I've been talking about with ArtSpeak interns about burnout. I know, you know, Caroline, Christine, Desiree, we're doing this work on that personal and professional level so much. How do you work around burnout and like exhaustion and like finding those breaks for yourself? Sorry, I have a nephew and a dog in the background who like to scream at each other. And so, yeah, if you would like to answer that.
That's a really great question. I was in an internal workshop session today, and where we were really actually, one of our colleagues was facilitating a session on love and what it means to actually lead from love. But in the course of that, one of these kind of bullet point things was this idea of self-care, and how self-care is actually a radical act, a radical revolutionary act, and which was something really interesting to sit with, because I think you're right. Like, I know I am, and we all are, so like, okay, got to do this, got to do this, got to do this. And it's really difficult to remember to take care of yourself. And so I just found that little nugget of thinking about it as this, that's actually the work too, is just remembering to stop and take care of yourself. And so I'm going to have to try to remember that.
Yeah, definitely. Would anyone else like to contribute?
Yeah, sure. It is something that I really nag everybody at the museum about, is really kind of taking a break from this work. A lot of what we're doing and what we're prioritizing in this moment, where we've been closed to the public since March, is we're prioritizing the repatriation of Native American cultural objects and human remains. And it's heavy, heavy work. And so really being a nag at everybody at the museum about making sure to take breaks, create that separation as best as you can from work, since work has infiltrated the home. I fully admit I'm doing a very terrible job of that lately. So I really need to wash my hair, drink more water, go outside. So I have a to-do list for tomorrow.
Go ahead, Desiree.
Yeah, and I can add, it's really hard to not burn out. And I can say I'm almost there, right? It's really difficult. And I mean, I was there in the summer. I was there. I felt like I had no support. And, you know, as one of the few Black people who work in the museum, you know, there were layoffs and many Black people were laid off. So there were even fewer Black people in the museum. And you know, the timing of these statements that are coming out, and you know, it was just like, it was a mess. But I think one of the things that has helped to prevent me from burning out is that I have an amazing, I have two things. One is I have an amazing boss, my supervisor, who is the director of, I don't know what her title is. She's the director of basically teacher education. And she makes sure that I'm okay. She checks on me. She runs, she's a mediator for me. So, you know, because I look like I look, everybody in the museum wants me to be on their flyers. They want me to come and talk at their things. They want me to go and do this. They want to go and do that. People all over the world are sending me, can you come talk to me for Black History Month? Can you come into my classroom? Okay, no, I cannot. And my boss says no, right? So she's very good at checking in with me. We have a biweekly check-in, and even sometimes more frequently than that. And she'll just say, how are you doing? Do you need to take a day off? Do you need a mental health day? And I'll be like, I do, but I don't have the time. I have too much work to do. And she says, I don't care. You're taking Friday off. Because if you don't, you're not going to get the work done. You're not going to make it, right? And she's absolutely right. But I often forget about that because I'm from academia. I'm all about that hustle and that grind. And like, that's what you have to do. And she's really good at like stopping me. She just, you know, like she'll put her hand on my forehead, like, stop, don't move forward, please stop. And it's amazing. And my colleagues are all amazing, you know? And the second thing that helps me a lot, three things. Okay. The second thing is my dog. I walk my dog every day and she doesn't know what's going on. And all she cares about is like, I got to go outside. So you need to take me and get fresh air and go outside. I need to run. We need to go hiking. And so that's really helpful for me. And the third is the nap ministry. So there's this woman who runs a program called the Nap Ministry, and it's really about self-care and about taking care of yourself and pushing against that grind culture. I'll put a link in the chat. And I have found that extremely powerful because I'm a napper. And it's really nice to like have someone who's like, yo, I'm creating a whole kind of structure around the importance of napping and resting and just taking a moment to step back and say, what am I doing? And do I need to be doing it? Is it good for me? Right? So I would say those three things are my lifesavers right now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your thoughts, everyone. I definitely hear the self-love and the self-care motto happening. It's very California. I'm not originally from California, so that stands out to me as a priority. But I also think that there's an undercurrent to a lot of what you all were saying, is that we need to be cognizant of tokenism, right? Cognizant of what we're asking people to do because of what they look like or because of what they're involved in. And sometimes that means taking on the responsibility ourselves or being cognizant of how another person might feel and making up some of that slack and exploring that work. So I appreciate your thoughts. Caroline, you are up next if you would like to read your question for the panel.
Sure, thank you. So my question for you all is whether or not your organization had a black square or made a statement. What kind of feedback did you have from your community, your public, whether it's just the general public, your coworkers, your board?
Yeah,
I can take that one since anyway. Yes, we did not have a black square. We did make a statement that was late, in my opinion. But we did make a statement, and it was very interesting. I didn't follow exactly, like I had to stop for a while and take a break from it all. But I did see that some of the feedback that we were getting from the public, like on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, was kind of, some of it was good. Some of it was like, thank you for saying this. This is great. And then there was some of it that was like, why are you doing this? You're a science museum, right? And then even further, there was some that was probably people who used to work at the museum or people who are very attached to the museum and also attached to social justice. And there were people who were using Instagram and Twitter and Facebook to be like, hey, okay, cool. That's nice that you have these words. What are you going to do about it, right? Where's the accountability? And so I really appreciated that those people were there doing that. And I can't say what happened with it all because, you know, we're still in progress, but I do know that that did happen as far as the public goes.
I think that's exactly why Mass Action launched that accountability campaign, is that there, it was very clear that there was, you know, hundreds of performative statements being put out. And I think Mass Action felt it critical to put up that criteria, put up something to hold yourself accountable for. Yeah, I just wanted to add that little piece in.
Yeah, definitely. Triana, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just quickly, I had to go back and look at the statements. It's been a long time since I've seen them. We posted one original statement and it was so vague, and there was a lot of negative feedback because it was so vague, both from staff and from our audience. And then we posted another letter that was more, I think, you know, both of them had been asked to be edited by a small group of people at the museum who also serve on the task force to make sure like language is okay. And not all of the suggestions are used. And I think that is a big issue. You're going to come to staff mostly BIPOC staff who do this work and then not actually take all of those suggestions into consideration when sharing it, because we have to then take it to the board and to the executive team, and things always get changed then. And I think that was something I really struggled with, of this blanket statement and then everyone in staff being like, wait, are we actually doing that? Because I don't think we're doing that. And so I think it's been like a learning experience for me to know that people just make these statements and now we have to hold them accountable. And I'm glad like programs like this can help people do that.
Yeah.
I want to add, you know, they're asking Black, Indigenous, and people of color to give their feedback, but then, and not take it, but they're also not paying us for that work, right? This is all extra traumatic emotional labor. And so that's really frustrating. That's all I wanted to add.
Desiree, do you want to go ahead and give us your question?
Oh, okay. So yeah, it's interesting because actually Caroline sort of stole my question, but then I thought of another one after she asked it, and then Triana actually sort of answered it already. But the question is like, you know, did you write a statement? Did your museum write a statement? And if they did, who participated in the writing? Did they ask people to like, did they actually ask people of color who worked in the museum? And not, I don't mean like one or two people. I mean like all of the people. Did management check in with people of color, right? Like, I'm really curious about that. And I'm wondering what that's like in different museums.
If no one minds, I might actually interject. So my museum did write a statement. I'm also, our staff is really small. It's 5 people. I'm the only person of color in the entire staff. We don't really have a lot of oversight. I was the one that introduced the idea of writing a statement. I was the one that wrote the statement. I was the one that edited the statement and posted the statement. Mostly out of a sense of self-responsibility, right? The viewpoint that I take as a person of color, being able to express that, I felt that I wanted that ownership of it instead of giving it to someone else that might not have the same experience as me. But again, through this conversation, I'm reminded of things like tokenism and burnout. And we've built on that statement, which is wonderful to see. And we've worked with our small staff to be able to not just be performative, but that was my personal experience. And I have a feeling that a lot of other people, especially in smaller institutions or institutions where DEAI is a committee or a small fraction of a larger staff, that they have similar experiences. Okay, does anyone else want to share?
Yeah, I can talk about our processes. We also have a very small staff at the Hearst Museum, and the Hearst Museum staff is not very diverse. It was a small group of us that worked on the statement together, and we aligned it with what the campus had communicated out, kind of thinking of the Hearst Museum and our positionality, and who are we to say something while we continue to create this ongoing trauma to all manner of people, being who we are. But I think that the frustration in this statement and in creating of the statement is your personal views and your personal values are never going to be quite aligned with the organization and how the glacial pace that an organization can change, even when you're in charge of it. And so I think a lot of us felt like it ended up being a pretty blah statement, just regardless of how we all actually felt in that moment. And the same thing happened very recently where we made a statement about the unnaming of Kroeber Hall, and that we were aligned and appreciative of the campus's decision in that. And the kind of feedback that we got pushback from that statement. We didn't get any, not that I recall, any really responses from the Black Lives Matter statement.
Yeah, great. Thank you all for engaging in these extra steps, providing your insight and your thoughts. I do, before we stop for breakout rooms, being cognizant of time, I want to give our audience an opportunity to ask us questions directly. So for those who are watching or listening, feel free to put your questions in the chat and I will make sure that our panelists answer them. So we'll give you a moment to do that. You know, if that conversation is not really flowing, then we can transition to the breakout rooms. But I think most important is the conversation that our panelists are being able to engage with our participants. So I see that Jonathan has a question in the chat and they say, have any of your institutions been called out on social media to any large degree? If so, how did they respond, if at all, internally, publicly? I'm thinking about Change the Museum on Instagram. Okay. So it's freeform if anyone would like to unmute themselves and answer. Yeah, go ahead, Desiree.
Yes. I mean, I can't say how large of a degree it was because, again, I was trying to, for my own sanity, step back a bit. But we were called out on Change the Museum a couple of times. And I don't remember if we were called out explicitly by name or not. I think we were. But I do remember that there was a lot of discussion internally, but not necessarily from the people in charge, but by the staff, right? And so there would just be this kind of buzz, like, oh my gosh, what are they going to do? How are they going to respond to this? And I do know that some people were like commenting directly on some of our social media posts, as I mentioned before. And sometimes the museum's response was to just delete those, which they then got called out for, because that is problematic. And I think that they have since shifted and they've done a great job. I think part of the thing was like, you know, the people who are in charge of our web, they're not trained to deal with this kind of adversity. They're trained to like produce content and post it online, and it's very good content that we post. But when we get this animosity, it's kind of like, oh my gosh, what do we do? And what do we do on such a short timeline? And the way that social media tends to snowball, you know, we have been improving our process. And so I don't know how big, like I have not talked to people who don't know that I work at the museum and are talking about like, oh my gosh, did you hear about the thing that happened? Like all these people are talking about the Exploratorium. But I do remember that there was actually like a newspaper article about the layoffs that we were experiencing, which kind of was a big deal, both publicly and internally.
Awesome. Riffing off of that, we do have another question. Amanda asks to Desiree, Dr. Whitmore specifically, point to your point about staff buzz versus leadership. Do any of the panelists have suggestions on how to lead from behind or to manage up, as they would say?
I can add to that. I don't think we have been called out explicitly on Change the Museum. There's been some posts that were like, oh, that's us. It's totally us. And we've had those conversations within staff. We, the DEAI leadership, really try to take what we hear from staff and bring it up to when we have those one-on-one conversations with anyone who's in higher management. I think to that question specifically, I think, you know, being honest, like taking it and saying, this is out there about the museum. How should we respond? How do we fix this problem? Because responding is not the only way to fix it. I think some organizations really get that wrong. Putting a statement out there is not the only way. You have to actually find the root of that issue and fix that problem. And I think you know, we have so many conversations between the five of us that are in the leadership, but we always try to make sure that we take it to someone who has more power than us at the institution so that it gets elevated. And it's the only way, you know, when you work in a hierarchical organization, you have to kind of play with it to understand like how things get solved and worked out.
I can add, oh, sorry.
No, Christine, go ahead.
I just wanted to add a little bit of insight for what I've witnessed working is actually power in numbers. So, you know, kind of back to traditional organizing, but if it's one person, you know, but I think that's something I feel like we've all maybe seen about this particular moment in time where there's also a tension on things need to change, and that those of us who aren't in leadership have a lot of power if we come together and speak in a more unified voice. Well, as unified to be, but that there is power in that in this particular moment and in coming together.
Yeah, absolutely. Caroline, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, so the Hearst Museum is absolutely been called out, any type of public platform that you have. And we also had people very directly respond through like responding to our newsletter postings and saying things like, yeah, that's great and all, but do more. And very similar to what you were saying earlier, Desiree, about former employees at the Exploratorium, saying things that are very similar, like that's great, but do more. Or where's the action? So I really appreciate the comments like that because absolutely, like this is not enough and we do need to do more. And so those are the ones that I really like. It's nice to get the good job, everybody, positive feedback. We also have a fair amount of things like, I don't think that person's a racist, but I am, and let me tell you how. Those are kind of scary to get. But the ones that are just like, you need to do more. And I really like that accountability because you can, I don't know, you can get wore out, you can get complacent, and it's that kick in the pants that you need. Like, nope.
Yeah, you definitely made a great point. I think if we're museums and our entire purpose is to engage with our community, right? To be able to be these sources where people can go to and have a resource for information, we do need to be held accountable, right? We do need to be the ones that are saying, okay, well, we've done this thing, we put a statement, there are words on a website, where do we go from here? And how do we really seep into making DEAI an integral part of our organization? Because you always run the risk of being performative. Even if you're excited about your work, even if you're charging full steam ahead, right? What you don't want to do is just be temporal and be performative. You want to seep that into your organization and make it lasting. We do have another question. Also, just for clarification, like I said, I wanted to prioritize our audience questions with the amount of time that we have left. So I think at this point, I'm going to do that. And then if we have a little bit of extra time, we'll do the breakout rooms, but I would rather prioritize our audience questions. So the next question I have is, could you talk about if and how DEAI work is being incorporated into your institution's board of directors specifically? Yeah, if anyone has a point of view, I unfortunately do not. So I'd appreciate some answers.
I can, yes. We heard recently that our executive team is working with our board to create a DEAI committee that exists within the board. So we have a really big board at the Asian Art Museum, and there are small groups of board members that focus on parts of the museum. So we have like an education board committee, a marketing and PR board committee, and they're creating a DEAI board committee to help with that work. Part of the readiness assessment that we're doing, we're actually using the mass action readiness assessment, and we are getting ready to launch it soon, have been telling our leadership that diversity and diversifying our staff should not just be within the staff. We have to do it on the board level too. And sometimes we get things like, our board is diverse. We have way more people of color on our board than we did before. And I'm like, well, we're a culturally specific museum that like it would be weird if our board was all white because we're a culturally specific museum. So yes, we do have a diverse board in that way, but we've been really pushing for diversity in other ways. So like socioeconomic status, background, education, like making sure that our board kind of covers all of it. So hopefully this committee can help with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that insight, Triana. I do have another question from Alexandra, who asks, what advice would you give to a museum that is beginning its concerted institutional DEAI work? So at the very beginning of trying to climb this wonderful but exhausting uphill battle.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, you go ahead. I was simply going to point you to the Mass Action Toolkit and the readiness assessment that Triana just mentioned as a really good, and there's many instruments out there, but that gauges kind of where you're at, where you want to go, and Triana, you guys can probably speak to how it's been a helpful tool, but that tool is out there.
And I just want to add, get the buy-in of the leadership of the museum. Without them doing the work, it doesn't matter, right? And so you can do all the work you want, and you can exhaust yourself and burn out, just like Triana asked us about. But unless you get them to actually be doing the work, right? They need their own DEI committee. They can't just ask you all to do it and then report back, right? There either needs to be a person in charge doing all of the things that reports directly to the director, or you have to have a committee that reports directly to the director, because otherwise it's just not going to have legs, in my experience.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you made, Desiree. I know that I have some colleagues who have started this work and really didn't have that upper division or the institutional support, and they very quickly ran into burnout, and they ran into feeling like they were on this uphill battle that wasn't really getting anywhere. And sometimes even having their work be used for a profit or a sell or a very performative action that wasn't really entrenched. So again, I circle back to the self-care that we were talking about, right? Monitoring why you're here. If the things that you're doing are helping yourself, and of course they're attempting to help others, but just being aware of the space that you choose to do this work as well. Chris asks, what can white museum workers do specifically to advance DEAI goals? Clearly we need to ask the input of BIPOC, but how do we strike the balance between respect and undue emotional labor? Should museums request the assistance of BIPOC employees rather than assign it as a duty? It's an interesting take. Would anyone like to respond?
I can say a little bit about that, is that it's very much the responsibility of white museum professionals to educate yourself. It's not anybody else's responsibility. And especially don't ask your BIPOC coworkers to educate you. If you have the internet, you have the smartphone, educate yourself as best you can, and then ask questions. And so that's kind of like my advice there, is to really do the work first before you ask for help.
I want to second that. Do your own work, right? Like it's not our job to educate you. And we have been educating people for our entire lives. So we're tired, you know? So educate yourself, and also speak out. When you see something that you don't agree with, say something about it, right? Like part of the problem, like the reason why people of color have been referred to as minorities is because we're not around. There aren't enough of us. And then even when we are around, our voices are not heard. People don't listen to us, but they listen to you, right? And so if enough of you speak up and say that this is wrong, right? Like you are doing the work of being an ally, and you are getting things done, but we can't be the ones to do all of this work. And as far as like asking, requesting assistance instead of assigning it, absolutely. Don't put me on committees. Like, ask me if I'd like to be a part of the committee, and then I can make that decision myself. But yeah, don't just assign things, because then that leads to, and this happens in academia all the time, faculty of color leave at much higher rates than their white counterparts. And it's because we get put on all the DEI committees. We get like on all the mentorship things, we get put on like everything that has anything to do with diversity. And it's like, can we just have a break? Can all white people do it for a change? Like, I think that would be great. And you can do something and then ask for help later, right? Like that's literally like, do your homework, right? If you go to your professor's office hours, hopefully you opened the book first, or you looked at your notes. You're not just going to go to your office hours and be like, so professor, I was sleeping through class and I really don't understand anything that you said, right? You're going to say, okay, I have a question about problem 7 and I read the book and I didn't understand this thing. Can you help me? And I think that's what needs to happen.
Can I just add, as a white person, I also recommend, and this is kind of like life-wide, not just museums, but I think you can take this into museums, is there are white ally groups out there. And I just feel like I want to put a shout out to Surge, which is standing up for racial justice. I highly recommend that, you know, every white person who hasn't been really engaged with doing that deep work, like it is our responsibility. And Surge is pretty well suited to train and educate and bring white people into conversation about just this. So I absolutely would encourage anyone to check them out.
One quick thing, Jess. We at the Asian Art Museum, the DEAI leadership created like recommendations for doing this work moving forward, and we really pushed and advocated for hiring a consultant to help us with the readiness assessment. So we hired someone, Dina Bailey, she's amazing, to help us lead the entire readiness assessment and facilitate the listening sessions with staff and to disaggregate all the data that comes from it. And we are paying her through a grant that we were able to apply for. And so I would say that's a really great step, is making sure your museum is applying for funding for doing this work so that you can hire and pay someone and you don't have to rely on your staff who have full-time jobs already to do all of that work. It was such a relief to hire her so that the 5 of us don't have to spend all of our evenings and weekends doing this work. So please hire people to do the work and pay them what they're asking for, because they deserve it. They're doing that exhaustive, burdensome work for you and they deserve to be paid. So please pay them. Apply for funding if your museum doesn't have funding.
Yeah, Triana, you make a really great point. I've kind of noticed this thread that we always talk about people who are engaged in the work, right? And whether you are a person of color or not, that doesn't necessarily mean that you want to be doing DEAI work, just because you may be the person that people think of when they start to get into this type of work. So being mindful of the fact that maybe it's not just that you don't want to be put on a committee as a duty instead of a volunteer opportunity, but maybe you don't want to be involved with this at all. And that's okay, right? That's where those of us who maybe don't identify as people of color or who are white can pick up that baton and say, what can I do? Like we've been talking about, and really try and take the lead on that work. And also hiring someone from outside or getting some outside help if you feel that you're looking around and you don't really have the tools to be able to participate in this super crucial movement. Okay, I do have another question. For clarification, someone had asked, what organization is Dina Bailey with? We are looking for consultants for OMCA.
I put her link in the chat. So it's Mountaintop Vision LLC, and she lives and works out of Atlanta, but has been great over Zoom with us because we wouldn't be in person right now anyways.
I've done a lot of work with Dina actually through Mass Action, and she's fabulous. So I highly recommend her.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for providing that resource. I'm sure Dina hopefully gets a lot of business out of this. I think they would appreciate it. Considering we have a concrete resource, I actually have a question for the panel. This is a little bit difficult, but in creating this program, we really wanted to, at Cultural Connections, not just discuss DEAI, but have our participants come away with something that was concrete, right? The next step that they could do. So we've talked about tokenism, we've talked about performativity, we've talked about the statement and the social media and sort of the larger engagement. Can you offer a tool or resource or piece of advice about a concrete next step that we can take to make sure that we're not just doing a hashtag, Blackout Tuesday, or just putting up a BLM statement, but we're really letting this sink into our organizations and how we operate from now on? Take a minute.
Well, I could chime in because I think that the criteria that I offered through the accountability campaign, I think is actually, it is a starting place. I mean, I think that was the intention of it, right? Like it was a criteria for evaluating statements, but it came from, well, what really actually needs to happen and what is the work to do it. I mean, you know, it's because it's hard to have all our institutions are at so many different places and entry points, right? So we've named some things like get leadership on board, of course, is number one, but I just offer kind of going back to those criterias as like kind of really digging into each of those, because it gets a little bit more specific into how you're actually moving that forward.
Yes, and I think using those criteria methodology that you suggested, Christine, gives people a data set to really be able to work off of and do something, right? Instead of just responding to what they might see others doing, or responding to what they think they should be doing next on social media, or whatever they see as the next step. Would anyone else like to add or offer a resource or concrete step?
I can talk about the, with sharing resources. Again, kind of plugging that of By for All program. We're really enjoying it. And we're really getting a lot out of that at the Hearst Museum. And the other sort of concrete things that you can do within your own organization is figure out where are you positioned in that organization? What kind of power do you have? Who listens to you? And how can you influence them by getting them to listen to you and hear you, if you have any power at all? And so it can kind of, I always assume that nobody listens to me, and then I get really surprised when people actually act on something that I recommended or advised. So if you have that capacity in your position, in your organization, to get somebody who's above you, who's capable of making more things happen, listen to you and hear you, see if you can get that started.
Yeah, for sure. Having that awareness about who you're actually able to engage with and who's listening to you is very important. You don't just want to be screaming into the void, as they might say. Triana or Desiree, would you like to add? No, okay.
Well, I mean, I was going to say basically exactly what Caroline just said, right? It's like, you got to figure out, like, who are you and what can you do? And like we said earlier, do your homework, right? The more you know, the more informed you are, and the better you are, the better prepared you are to inform others and help them. Because the more and more people come to me, the more and more tired I am, and I can't do it anymore, And so I need help. I need you all to help. And so, like, if you start it, then you can get it done. But, like, you got to start.
Very wise, but very simple words. Thank you for that. Yeah, sometimes it just is the decision to decide to start and to see what you can collect for yourself and to see how you can really engage with the work that's going on. The beautiful thing about the place that we're in society is there are so many resources and so many conversations and so many publications and books to be able to educate yourself and to see what really is that next step for you in your personal life or in your organizational life. So it is 7 o'clock, and I appreciate when things are within the time frame that they say they're going to be in. So I do want to take the chance to conclude our program for tonight. Thank you so much to all of our participants for joining us, for being lenient with us as we changed our formatting while we're talking about this discussion. Thank you also to our panelists for your time and your expertise and your wonderful thoughts. I hope that our participants can take away with us from this something to really be able to think about in the long term. In the meantime, please make sure that you check Cultural Connection social media and emails for upcoming events, and have a wonderful night. Stay safe and healthy. And thank you everyone for being with us.